who cannot with like profit sell their products as cheaply as the larger, more favorably situated English farmers, with whom, however, they are obliged to compete. Moreover, in some places the quality of the land admits of the raising of livestock only, which is but slightly profitable. Then too, these Welsh farmers, by reason of their separate nationality, which they retain pertinaciously, are much more stationary than the English farmers. But the competition among themselves, and with their English neighbours, and the increased mortgages upon their land consequent upon this has reduced them to such a state that they can scarcely live at all, and because they have not recognized the true cause of their wretched condition, they attribute it to all sorts of small causes, such as high tolls, etc., which do check the development of agriculture and commerce, but are taken into account as standing charges by every one who takes a holding, and are therefore really ultimately paid by the landlord. Here too, the new poor law is cordially hated by the tenants, who hover in perpetual danger of coming under its sway. In 1843, the famous Rebecca disturbances broke out among the Welsh peasantry. The men dressed in women's clothing, blackened their faces, and fell in armed crowds upon the toll gates, destroyed them amidst great rejoicing and firing of guns, demolished the toll-keepers' houses, wrote threatening letters in the name of the imaginary Rebecca, and once went so far as to storm the workhouse of Carmarthen. Later, when the militia was called out, and the police strengthened, the peasants drew them off with wonderful skill upon false scents, demolished toll gates at one point while the militia, lured by false signal bugles, was marching in some opposite direction, and betook themselves finally, when the police was too thoroughly reinforced, to single incendiarisms and attempts at murder. As usual, these greater crimes were the end of the movement. Many withdrew from disapproval, others from fear, and peace was restored of itself. The government appointed a commission to investigate the affair and its causes, and there was an end of the matter. The poverty of the peasantry continues, however, and will one day, since it cannot under existing circumstances grow less, but must go on intensifying, produce more serious manifestations than these humorous Rebecca masquerades. If England illustrates the results of the system of farming on a large scale and Wales on a small one, Ireland exhibits the consequences of over-dividing the soil. The great mass of the population of Ireland consists of small tenants who occupy a sorry hut without partitions, and a potato patch just large enough to supply them most scantily with potatoes through the winter. In consequence of the great competition which prevails among these small tenants, the rent has reached an unheard-of height, double, treble, and quadruple that paid in England. For every agricultural labourer seeks to become a tenant farmer, and though the division of land has gone so far, there still remain numbers of labourers in competition for plots. Although in Great Britain 32 million acres of land are cultivated, and in Ireland but 14 million, although Great Britain produces agricultural products to the value of £150 million, and Ireland of but £36 million, there are in Ireland 75,000 agricultural proletarians more than in the neighbouring Ireland 272. How great the competition for land in Ireland must be is evident from this extraordinary disproportion, especially when one reflects that the labourers in Great Britain are living in the utmost distress. The consequence of this competition is that it is impossible for the tenants to live much better than the labourers, by reason of the high rents paid. The Irish people is thus held in crushing poverty, from which it cannot free itself under our present social conditions. These people live in the most wretched clay huts, scarcely good enough for cattle pens, have scant food all winter long, or, as the report above quoted expresses it, they have potatoes half enough 30 weeks in the year, and the rest of the year nothing. When the time comes in the spring at which this provision reaches its end, or can no longer be used, because of its sprouting, wife and children go forth to beg, and tramp the country with their kettle in their hands. Meanwhile the husband, after planting potatoes for the next year, goes in search of work either in Ireland or England, and returns at the potato harvest to his family. This is the condition in which 9/10 of the Irish country folks live. They are poor as church mice, wear the most wretched rags, and stand upon the lowest plane of intelligence possible in a half-civilized country. According to the report quoted, there are, in a population of 8.5 millions, 585,000 heads of families in a state of total destitution, and according to other authorities, cited by Sheriff Ellison, 272b there are in Ireland 2,300,000 persons who could not live without public or private assistance, or 27% of the whole population corpus. The cause of this poverty lies in the existing social conditions, especially in competition here found in the form of the subdivision of the soil. Much effort has been spent in finding other causes. It has been asserted that the relation of the tenant to the landlord who lets his estate in large lots to tenants, who again have their subtenants, and sub-subtenants, in turn, so that often 10 middlemen come between the landlord and the actual cultivator. It has been asserted that the shameful law which gives the landlord the right of expropriating the cultivator who may have paid his rent duly, if the first tenant fails to pay the landlord, that this law is to blame for all this poverty. But all this determines only the form in which the poverty manifests itself. Make the small tenant a landowner himself, and what follows? The majority could not live upon their holdings, even if they had no rent to pay, and any slight improvement which might take place would be lost again in a few years in consequence of the rapid increase of population. The children would then live to grow up under the improved conditions who now die in consequence of poverty in early childhood. From another side, comes the assertion that the shameless oppression inflicted by the English is the cause of the trouble. It is the cause of the somewhat earlier appearance of this poverty, but not of the poverty itself. Or the blame is laid on the Protestant Church forced upon a Catholic nation, but divide among the Irish what the Church takes from them, and it does not reach 6 shillings a head. Besides, tithes are a tax upon landed property, not upon the tenant, though he may nominally pay them. Now, since the Commutation Bill of 1838, the landlord pays the tithes directly, and reckons so much higher rent, so that the tenant is none the better off. And in the same way 100 other causes of this poverty are brought forward, all proving as little as these. This poverty is the result of our social conditions. Apart from these, causes may be found for the manner in which it manifests itself, but not for the fact of its existence. That poverty manifests itself in Ireland thus and not otherwise, is owing to the character of the people, and to their historical development. The Irish are a people related in their whole character to the Latin nations, to the French, and especially to the Italians. The bad features of their character we have already had depicted by Carlyle. Let us now hear an Irishman, who at least comes nearer to the truth than Carlyle, with his prejudice in favour of the Teutonic character. 273. They are restless, yet indolent, clever, and indiscreet, stormy, impatient, and improvident, brave by instinct, generous without much reflection, quick to revenge and forgive insults, to make and to renounce friendships, gifted with genius prodigally, sparingly with judgment. With the Irish, feeling and passion predominate, reason must bow before them. Their sensuous excitable nature prevents reflection and quiet, persevering activity from reaching development. Such a nation is utterly unfit for manufacture as now conducted. Hence they held fast to agriculture, and remained upon the lowest plane even of that. With the small subdivisions of land, which were not here artificially created, as in France, and on the Rhine, by the division of great estates, but have existed from time immemorial, an improvement of the soil by the investment of capital was not to be thought of, and it would, according to Allison, require £120 million to bring the soil up to the not very high state of fertility already attained in England. The English immigration, which might have raised the standard of Irish civilization, has contented itself with the most brutal plundering of the Irish people, and while the Irish, by their immigration into England, have furnished England a leaven which will produce its own results in the future, they have little for which to be thankful to the English immigration. The attempts of the Irish to save themselves from their present ruin, on the one hand, take the form of crimes. These are the order of the day in the agricultural districts, and are nearly always directed against the most immediate enemies, the landlord's agents, or their obedient servants, the Protestant intruders, whose large farms are made up of the potato patches of hundreds of ejected families. Such crimes are especially frequent in the south and west. On the other hand, the Irish hope for relief by means of the agitation for the repeal of the legislative union with England. From all the foregoing, it is clear that the uneducated Irish must see in the English their worst enemies, and their first hope of improvement in the conquest of national independence. But quite as clear is it too, that Irish distress cannot be removed by any act of repeal. Such an act would, however, at once lay bare the fact that the cause of Irish misery, which now seems to come from abroad, is really to be found at home. Meanwhile, it is an open question whether the accomplishment of repeal will be necessary to make this clear to the Irish. Hitherto, neither Chartism nor socialism has had marked success in Ireland.